Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Pam Metzger. I'm the director of the Deason Criminal Justice Reform Center, and I'm so happy to have you joining us for our webinar today, Greening the Desert, bringing criminal law practitioners to small, tribal, and rural communities. So in just a minute, I'm going to introduce our panelists, but I wanted first to tell you a little more about this presentation and about the work we're doing here at the Deason Center. The Deason Center focuses on three substantive areas: public defense, prosecution, and STAR justice. STAR stands, of course, for small, tribal, and rural, which is what today's program focuses on. When we think about STAR criminal justice systems, the first thing we want to do is define them. And so for our purposes, and a couple of our panelists were there when we came up with these definitions, we think about criminal justice systems that are characterized by long distances, by low caseload volumes, and by legal deserts, which is again the topic of our conversation today. Now, travel in long distances has trade-offs for lawyers and judges. It's harder to observe things, it's harder to build trust, and it's harder maybe to understand what's happening in a case. Conversely, it requires things. It takes time, it costs you money and travel and lost opportunity. And then there are opportunity costs to provide services that people lose in these STAR legal communities. In addition, these communities struggle with access to technology. You can see how much more heavily urban areas have access to broadband services than do rural and tribal communities. And while there's a temptation these days to think that, that technology, particularly in a COVID era, is going to solve these problems, the reality is that many of these communities continue to struggle because we have concerns about access, fairness, and privacy. And that ranges with everything from the broadband challenges I talked about a minute ago, to individual access to internet services, to questions about whether outcomes are the same, and about particularly the privacy that prosecutors may want to have with a witness, that defense attorneys want to have with a client, and what happens when we're using technology to engage in those kinds of important communications. We also know that low caseload volumes in these communities means low budgets and low frequency, by which I mean low frequency of court settings, and depending on your access to lawyers, which is part of what we're going to talk about today, low access to legal resources and practitioners. What these things can mean, sometimes it means long waits for case resolutions, reduced access to justice professionals, limited services for pretrial and reentry opportunities, and that's everything from legal services to mental health, therapeutic, substance abuse disorder, and occupational services. Travel may be challenging or even impossible, particularly in places where people might lose their driver's licenses as a consequence of a criminal conviction, or where poverty prevents people from having secure, reliable transportation, and there is no public transportation. And finally, we know from recent research by the Brennan Center and by governing.com that fines and fees appear to have increased importance in these long distance, low caseload volume systems. In other words, they're more heavily reliant on user fees from defendants primarily to build and maintain their budgets. And as we know, that has cyclical consequences that are negative rather than positive for the criminal justice system. We also know that there's a dearth of criminal judges. And in fact, in many states, we've seen states enact legislation to allow lay people to serve as judges, particularly in rural areas. This graphic, which is from our report that we're releasing today on greening legal deserts, you'll see that there's one state, South Carolina, that allows judges to sentence people to jail with only a college degree. There are 5 states that require a high school diploma. There are 15 states that require no educational prerequisites before a judge can send somebody to jail. And again, history and experience teaches us, and I think Professor Pruitt's going to be able to talk about this a little bit, that many of these legal deserts are places that are more prone to have lay judges because there simply haven't been lawyers to fill those slots. So strategies and innovations is what our conversation is about today. How do we address these problems? As I mentioned earlier, the Deason Center is releasing today a publication called Greening the Desert, and that publication will be available after the webinar. But today we wanted to preview these strategies, opportunities, and talk about legal deserts with a panel of experts. Briefly, I want to highlight at a high level what we'll be talking about. Strategies and innovations that can help green these deserts, financial incentives, uses of technology, educational pipelines, training, regionalized services, and law clinics are all some of the programs that our presenters are going to talk about. We're also going to talk about the South Dakota Bar Program, which one of our panelists is going to speak about with great detail, I think, because that's where she comes from. And I've put some details up here. I'm sure Kristen is going to talk about this for us in a minute, but this is a very unique program that brings lawyers with incentive payments to South Dakota, and we have proof that it works right here among us. Our panelists today are Kristen Kochekian, who works at the Gillette Law Office in South Dakota. And as I mentioned, she is a graduate of the Rural Attorney Recruitment Program, came from the East Coast, and is now a transplant to rural America. And she'll be telling us a little more about her experience and her insights. Professor Lisa Pruitt, who is the Martin Luther King Jr. Professor of Law at the UC Davis Law School and is the nation's leading expert on rurality and legality, and in particular, the questions that relate to how legal deserts and rurality interact to change, and unfortunately these days tend to harm people's lives due to the poverty of not only the resources that we contribute to those communities, but the research, right? A real lack of research other than Professor Pruitt's research that might tell us more about it. So she's going to share with us her insights, which are extensive, about what goes on in states with legal deserts, what causes them, and her thoughts about how law schools and governments can fix them. And lastly, but certainly not least, we have Ryan Reid. He is the attorney manager for the Superior region of the Wisconsin Public Defender's Office. Ryan comes to us with what I'm going to call a mixed background. He's practiced in an urban area and he's practiced in a rural area. And in the rural area, he's had to really think hard, not only about what attracts people to practice in rural areas, but how one recruits and supports rural practitioners at all levels to guarantee that the legal services being provided in small tribal and rural areas really do have the capacity to provide the same high level of services that we expect and demand for every other part of our United States community. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our panelists, and I'm going to kick it off by asking Professor Pruitt if she could tell us a little more about her work on legal deserts broadly, and then hone in perhaps for us particularly on criminal law deserts.
Sure. I'm just realizing that my AirPods are not connected, but hopefully you can hear me okay. Yes?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you so much for including me in this program today, Professor Metzger. So legal deserts or attorney deserts, these are terms that have just been coined in the last few years to refer to places where state Supreme Courts and the legal profession more generally have become aware that there are attorney shortages. And this issue really came into the consciousness of the bar, broadly speaking, when South Dakota kicked off its Project Rural Practice, which Kristen's going to be talking a little bit more about later. And that was in 2013, 2014. And since then, many states have become aware that they too are suffering from attorney deserts, and they've become more aware of what the consequences of these attorney shortages are for both the civil justice system and the criminal justice system. It seems like most of the discussion around this issue tends to be about civil justice. So it's great that the Deason Center is drawing attention to the criminal justice consequences of these attorney shortages. And going back to the University of South Dakota symposium in 2013 about this issue, courts were becoming aware, county governments that finance criminal justice systems were aware of the added costs that they were bearing because they were having to have attorneys drive in from other locations. So there are very pragmatic concerns. There are constitutional concerns, obviously. People living in rural areas, just like people living in urban areas and suburban areas, have expectations around policing and criminal justice systems. And of course, those institutions, criminal justice systems and policing are subject to constitutional requirements, including things like speedy trials and access to counsel. So there are a number of implications of these attorney deserts for criminal justice systems. On the topic of lay judges, this was very eye-opening for me when I first began to research what was happening in rural criminal justice systems, that people with no education were empowered to sentence people who had been arrested to jail time. And the Vera Institute has done great work around this particular issue. That is, they have identified that one of the reasons that jail populations are generally rising in rural areas, while they are generally falling on a per capita basis in urban areas, is because of the lack of attorneys who are present to actually represent people who are arrested at an initial appearance. So that sort of gives you a sense of some of the issues that are challenging for county governments and state governments that are running rural policing and rural criminal justice systems.
Thanks, Lisa. I'm wondering, Kristen and Ryan, I'd like to get your personal stories and let our audience hear a little more about what brought you to your practices in STAR areas. Kristen, you want to tell us a little bit? And I had such fun learning about your background when we were talking the other day. Kristen?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Sure can, thanks.
Okay, so my name is Kristen Kochekian. I am a participant in the Rural Attorney Recruitment Program. Thank you for having me here today. I grew up in North Carolina, went to school in Oklahoma, took the bar in Virginia after graduating from law school, returned home as most of us do to North Carolina while I was waiting on my bar passage results, got enmeshed back into the family business and ended up staying in North Carolina, doing in-house counsel work there, took the bar in North Carolina and assisted with multiple family businesses. My brother and I actually opened a storage warehouse business, which we ran for 3 years. Eventually I had some significant deaths in the family. I was looking for a change. I wanted to get back into what my goal was in becoming a lawyer in the first place, which was advocacy, helping people, being able to make a difference in their lives. And I was looking for a change professionally. I had seen an advertisement for the Rural Attorney Program late one night, rolling hills, buffaloes. Are you looking for a change? Are you looking for an adventure? It kind of ticked all my boxes. So I applied, I got in. I moved to South Dakota sight unseen, which most people probably wouldn't do. But it was honestly one of the best professional decisions I've ever made. I've been here 5 years now. The Rural Attorney Program is 5 years, so I'm wrapping up the end of my journey as a participant, but I have plans on staying in South Dakota and continuing my work here.
All right, thank you so much. Ryan, I'm going to hand it over to you because you've been also in both places, right? Urban and rural and everything in between.
For sure. Good afternoon. Again, thank you, Professor Metzger, for inviting me to speak. Yeah, I started my practice in the Green Bay area, working in kind of a rural office in Peshtigo, Wisconsin. I found my way to the Green Bay, Brown County office and worked there for some time. I was approached by management if I was interested in maybe going to Northwestern Wisconsin, which is having some retention and recruitment problems, and I agreed to do that. When I was in Peshtigo, I really enjoyed working in a more rural or smaller office. You get a lot more trial experience, you have a lot more connection with your manager and other private bar attorneys and with judges and district attorneys. So I think there's definitely advantages that I saw in having a rural practice, wanting to litigate cases, really wanting to assist my clients vigorously in trial and in motion practice. So I found that in a smaller office, more one-on-one contact, more opportunities that a lot of people were waiting years to have that I was having. So I really found it not only interesting and lots of work, but the idea that you have the Sixth Amendment right to assistance of counsel and to a vigorous defense and to a zealous defense. And I think that everyone in a big city and a medium-sized city and a rural area have the right to that. And I think as a statewide agency, the Wisconsin State Public Defender's Office really does focus on having an even representation in all offices and excellence. So because I believe that, you should walk the walk if you're going to talk the talk. So that's what I do and what I believe in, and why I work in a rural office.
Thanks, Ryan. Ryan, let me follow up a little bit, because your role has changed, right? You've gone from being a line assistant, right, to a manager, and so you're doing something that I think many lawyer managers don't do in urban areas, in a public defender office, which is you're having to think more, I think, about the private bar.
Yeah.
Talk about that a little bit.
For sure. So in Wisconsin, we have kind of a hybrid system where we have lots of staff attorneys, but for our conflicts and for overflow cases, we use private bar. We were really lucky to increase that rate. We're very proud of, advocating for private bar also getting, reimbursed and treated fairly. So that private bar also needs educational opportunities, also needs mentoring. A lot of private bar that work for our agency or take cases from our agency are solo practitioners or one or two people. So we offer a public defender conference every year. We have online trainings. We have things we offer in person around the state. But in a rural office, you'll get calls from private bar. Hey, have you litigated this issue? Or I need help with this TPR or termination of parental rights case. So it's a lot more, as a manager, I see it more as I'm not just managing my staff, I'm also managing private bar. I'm also answering questions. There's resources that our offices have that maybe private bar don't have access to. So a lot of people are like, hey, can I stop at the office? Can I meet my client at your office? So I think offering some things that may not be as kosher in a bigger area or a more urban area, really treating private bar as more as pseudo staff attorneys to make sure that level of representation for our clients is there. So definitely more of a village family perspective with private bar.
And Kristen, you're part of that private bar. And when we spoke the other day, we talked a little bit about what's challenging for a private practitioner practicing, right? Not in a public defender office, right? But as an appointed lawyer, or in some places as a contract lawyer, which is parenthetically the experience many prosecutors have as well, right? They're contract prosecutors, they're part-time, and like some of the lawyers Ryan's talking about, their practices are a mix of civil, criminal, family law, which might parenthetically be the experience of many of the judges that you're appearing in front of. Can you talk a little bit about sort of what it means from a financial and job stability perspective to practice criminal law in a rural area?
So I guess the short of the answer is that general practice helps. When you move to a star community, you can, in criminal defense, be retained privately. And I am a court-appointed attorney, which means that the court appoints me for a reduced rate to represent indigent defendants. However, general practice helps to subsidize that. There's a ton of crossover in between, as you noted, family law, estate planning, and criminal defense as well. My hourly rate, for example, is $190 an hour private pay. The court-appointed attorney rate this year is $97 an hour with $1 per mile. So there's a difference in, of course, the rate, but then again, for people that are moving here and building their own practice, there is a stability with court appointments because you know that the money is coming in the door rather than collecting bills. Of course, collecting the funds that are owed is a huge part of having a law practice, especially in a rural community. So it does help to subsidize that overhead. Travel is a huge component as well. The geographic distance between going to see clients, having to bill clients. With court appointments, you have to get permission of the court to travel outside of the county to go see your client. That is, of course, an obstacle as well. As far as income, the Rural Attorney Program provides a stipend, as I said, annually for 5 years. That's for tremendous benefit to South Dakota and the rural attorney program counties because that helps for people to move here that are legal professionals, help to cover overhead, and to allow 5 years for the practice to build up and help subsidize that income. And then as far as challenges, resources are always an issue as well. We, for example, have, of course, a methamphetamine problem in South Dakota, which is also affecting the rest of the country. We don't have a drug court in our county, which is a tremendous asset to people that are dealing with addiction, provides accountability, provides weekly contact with the court, with chemical dependency counselors, with mental health counselors, resources that are imperative to addiction and overcoming it. That is available in a neighboring county of ours, which is a larger county, a much larger county. And so they have the benefit of those resources. Our county is much smaller, we just don't. So trying to navigate between resources and access is an important challenge that we have to navigate.
So I want to, Kristen laid out a couple of things that I want to bring everybody else in on the discussion. I heard 3 real themes that I want to talk about. I want to get us talking about financial incentives and what we have to do to make rural practice affordable. And I know Professor Pruitt has some thoughts about lost student debt, loan forgiveness programs, and those kinds of things. I want to talk about what the rates are in rural areas, because in South Dakota, it sounds like at least for a while, you're ahead of Wisconsin, for example, for a long time, right? Not, you know, because Wisconsin has been struggling with these private counsel rates. And I think, Ryan, maybe you can talk about that in a second. And then I do want to talk a little more about travel and these specialty courts. I'll note for those of you that are interested in this topic of specialty courts, we point out in our publication, there are almost no specialty courts in STAR communities, in part because they require intensive criminal law adjacent resources. Most STAR communities are mental health deserts, meaning there aren't enough medical professionals to serve them. And so those are other concerns we're going to raise. But let's talk for a minute about financial incentives. And Lisa, can I ask you to talk for a minute about the financial pressures associated with law school debt and local payment rates for STAR communities?
Sure. So really, I think everyone who is involved with the legal profession these days is aware that law school tuition has spiked in the last few decades. And so students everywhere are coming out with their JD degrees with a lot more debt than they did, say, a couple of decades ago. And there are also huge disparities among schools. And in California, we have some of the highest average rates of tuition, I'm sorry to say, for ABA accredited schools. Schools that get more funding from their state legislatures, like South Dakota, and there are other schools. Alabama has, for example, has done better with funding from public sources. They've been able to keep their tuition rates lower, and there are other factors, of course. So I don't want to oversimplify why law school tuitions have spiked more in some places than others. But the bottom line is that everywhere, students are paying more than they were paying a couple of decades ago. So they're coming out of law school, by and large, highly leveraged. And so that can make entering rural practice look a lot more unsustainable. So concerns about, you know, how they're going to not only pay their office rent, but how they're going to pay their student loans. And so students, recent JD graduates are looking for, you know, more stability, and it's making rural a harder sell. And that's one thing that you know, South Dakota has just absolutely gotten right on a couple of fronts. First of all, they've managed to keep their tuition really quite low compared to many jurisdictions. And then, you know, they've really led the nation with this very innovative, put their money where their mouth is program that is subsidizing young lawyers like Kristen and taking them into rural communities. And I think what South Dakota has proved is that if you do make this fiscally doable, if you do make this financially a financially sustainable proposition, there are young lawyers who want to take advantage of these opportunities. Unfortunately, for most states, it's going to cost more to meaningfully subsidize a young lawyer. It's going to cost more than it does in South Dakota because of the higher tuition and higher student debt that many students are facing. So it's great to hold South Dakota up as a role model, and I do hold it up as a model for what can be done. But it's also important to recognize the limitations if you try to move that model wholesale to other jurisdictions.
So I want to throw this to Ryan here, and I'm going to interject with a couple of questions that have been coming in already from the chat. One question is whether Wisconsin and South Dakota have statewide public defender systems. And the other question was about the South Dakota rural stipend. Kristen, am I correct that it's 90% of the tuition and fees for the University of South Dakota? Oh, we can't hear you. You're on mute.
That's correct. It's based on 90% from USC Law School. I would just know I went to law school out of state, so my school debt's much higher than what someone in South Dakota would have paid. I still owe, but it is a tremendous resource for those that are moving to rural communities to help them.
Okay, so and I want to ask Ryan about public defense in Wisconsin, but I want to point out that while we're talking about this subject, it's really also important to remember that prosecutors are almost never organized in a statewide way, right? They're regionally elected and regionally hired, sometimes at a municipal level, sometimes on contract bids, sometimes on a per case basis. And with the exception of some regionalized services, which we're going to talk about in a minute, that means that for all those folks that are wondering about statewide capacity to set pay rates, to offer benefits, et cetera, it may well be that that's something easier to organize and orchestrate someplace like Wisconsin that has a statewide public defender system than it would be for someplace that has a decentralized defender system. And pretty much for everybody who has almost everybody has a decentralized system for county and municipal prosecution. So Ryan, can you talk a little bit about pay rates and in particular what that's looked like in rural Wisconsin?
Yeah, so we do have a statewide system for staff attorneys. We have offices in most counties. We have kind of one office, maybe covers multiple counties, staff attorney-wise. If you're a private bar that takes our cases, before we changed the rate, it was $40 an hour. Now it's $70 an hour. We really advocated hard to try to fix the constitutional crisis that was happening in our state, and really advocated to the legislature that this was the right thing to do, and succeeded on that. It really has helped to get private bar to more rural areas, so that was definitely a positive. The problem with that issue, because these are star communities with not a lot of attorneys are coming from far away. So we're really working with them to meet with their client more and set up phone calls and trying to facilitate some of that contact, because that's really what's important in litigating and representing clients is what are their interests, how do they want to proceed on cases, not just necessarily they have an attorney. So I think definitely that family and village perspective comes into play, but it definitely, we're getting attorneys, but making sure that the perspective and what they're offering is definitely appropriate.
So it's interesting because you and Kristen have both talked about travel, and we've talked a little bit about money. And of course, those two, as you pointed out, are really deeply intertwined. Particularly now that, COVID has happened and we're moving into this world where everyone is asking about video courts. One of the great ironies has been that many of our rural colleagues in prosecutors' offices and defender offices are leading the way, because many rural communities have been using technological adaptations to communicate with clients and to do status hearings and such for a long time. What's also been pretty clear to us at the Deason Center is that there's an alarming lack of research about how well this works and how fair it is, right? There's been very little done on this in a legal context. There's a study out of Chicago that indicated that bond rates for defendants who appeared by video were significantly higher than similarly situated defendants who appeared in person. We know that telemedicine, on the other hand, has found some good results. And we know that in the policing context, for example, interrogations can be enormously influenced just by the quality of lighting, right? If you have a dark-skinned defendant, for example, and you're doing an interrogation, they may look impassive if there are bright lights because you can't see their expressions. So we have on the one hand this real push to use technology to solve some of these travel and money issues. And on the other hand, we have these unknowns about travel. Bill Hellwig, who I hope is on here, but who's a DA in Texas in a rural community, at some point said to me, you have to earn your right to use the remote technology, right? You got to build your relationship first, and then you can start using it. But I'm curious to hear from all the panelists what your thoughts are about the ability of technology to improve either access to lawyers, meaning the numbers of lawyers who you might be able to bring in the way Ryan described, or the training and opportunity that lawyers have through using technology. And Ryan, you're kind of nodding, so I'm gonna throw it to you first, and then we'll see what folks want to add.
Yeah, there's definitely different schools of thought. I don't agree with. So I guess I think technology has really helped bring more attorneys to my area. I think it's really helped bring a diversity of attorneys, not just color or African American or white or Asian or Native American attorneys, but just young, old, different perspectives have been brought in situations where they haven't before. I think the ABA and maybe the Wisconsin Supreme Court need to come up with some better directives as to how to offer representation in an ethical way. I think making sure that contact is happening. I mean, obviously, a motion hearing should be in person. A preliminary hearing should be in person. But if it's just a scheduling conference, I think using phone or video can really cut down on travel time, because that scheduling conference may only be 5 minutes, but it takes 2 hours to get to that place. And that's time that attorney could have been reading discovery, asking for experts, working with other attorneys on cases. And I think technology also has let us offer trainings to a wider swath of people all over the state, compared to more of a regional training and hotel rooms and reimbursements. So I think technology can definitely be a positive, but again, I think we need to move slowly to allow for some rubric, some kind of ethical way of offering representation, because I am concerned that people are just showing up on video or on phone and not really having that lawyer-client relationship that I think is important.
And I just want to note here that some of our guests on this webinar are from national organizations that have done a lot of work on this. The National District Attorneys Association has been gathering materials and speaking about this to their members. The Texas Indigent Defense Commission has put together a great set of materials. The ABA has released a resolution on this. National Center for State Courts is considering it. And I think what I'm hearing and the information we're gathering here at the Deason Center is sort of in line with what Ryan is saying, is that there are appropriate uses and there are inappropriate uses, and the tough call is figuring out which they are and when you can use them. Kristen, anything you'd like to add?
I would agree. I think we use video conferencing and telephonic appearances when we can. I think it's invaluable to have your client in person with the judge for hearings. Again, as Ryan had noted, if it's a status hearing or a scheduling order, that's one thing. With COVID, we have had to rely more on telephonic and video conferences. It is a concern that perhaps the bond would be higher or not approved in those types of mediums if they were conversely in person. However, we're doing our best in South Dakota to try and navigate the struggles that we have with COVID. I would note that we do have some court reporters that are appearing by video, whereas everybody else is in person to try to kind of adapt to the different health issues that people might have individually. So I do think it's imperative that we have in-person availability, that we have court hearings and also we can meet with our clients individually and have that in-person contact. So I'm not entirely relying on technology to solve all of our woes, but I think it's a good tool to have in our kit.
So I'm going to just throw in here as well that, on the side of kind of other uses of technologies, there have been some very innovative things done, for example, in North Carolina, in helping domestic violence victims access courts and protective orders without showing up, right? So there are multiple ways to think about the technology, but I'm hearing the same cautionary notes kind of everywhere we go, which is that it needs to be thoughtful. Ryan and Lisa, I want to talk about recruiting for a minute, because we just got a question from a lawyer who writes, we're a 5-lawyer office 7,000 miles from the mainland. Due to lack of funds, have no money for training, so need an experienced lawyer, but pay low salaries, $45,000 to $65,000. And no one knows we are here, so it's hard to get the word out and recruit. We can't get student loan forgiveness, no stipends, ideas. So I'm gonna start with Ryan, who said something the other day about advocating for your community, and then I want to turn to Lisa, who's thought about this a little bit as well.
Yeah, I think, so I live in northwestern Wisconsin. Some of the perks, you know, I drive down rural roads and I see wildlife, and there's lots of hiking trails and lots of fishing and hunting. And I think using that as a selling piece, cost of living is low. Trying to think of other, but I also think, you know, advocating for, you know, this equal treatment of our clients, that, you know, someone in Milwaukee should have the same representation, the same zealous defense as in someone in Spooner or in Superior or in Ashland. So I think when you're thinking about recruitment and you're thinking about and retention, how can you use this, you know, salary usually you can't control, you know, loan forgiveness you can't control, but there's definitely different people that want that quality of life in your area, whatever that quality of life may be, and really using that to your advantage. So, and we've had mixed reviews. I mean, it's really hard to keep people, and that's just part of being a manager in a rural office. But I think when you're hiring and when you're getting the word out, trying to recruit people that fit your area or fit your office or fit your theme of why they're wanting to be a public defender in a rural area, because they're out there. I think, you know, and even my boss is constantly saying, you know, I went to law school in Vermont. How did you end up in Wisconsin? And I said, well, you know, I had a connection, and I really like this, and I really like that. So I think trying to build relationships with other people, because those people that want to work in rural areas are out there. You just need to find them, but they're hard to find.
Okay, Lisa, can you speak about this a little bit, maybe in terms of the law school perspective and the financing perspective?
Sure. Well, first of all, I just want to endorse what Ryan said. I think, you know, when you're recruiting, you know, young lawyers to come where you are, you want to play to your strengths and, you know, tap into, you know, finding young lawyers who are interested in what it is you have to offer. And, you know, many rural places have fabulous outdoor amenities. So if you're into rock climbing, maybe you want to go and, you know, live and work in a rural place where there's great rock climbing. So I heartily endorse that. I guess just my super practical advice is that the questioner needs to become with some career service directors at a lot of different law schools. I know these have been placed. There's always, you know, dozens of students, right, who are scrambling for jobs, and the career service. So there's a lot of opportunity for sort of individual matchmaking. I wanted to speak to what, you know, Professor Metzger was saying about loan forgiveness, and I heard the questioner say there's no opportunities for loan forgiveness, and that's really too bad, right? There are very few programs very few institutions, and mostly it's very wealthy law schools, are the institutions that have loan forgiveness for people who are serving as private practitioners an underserved community. So Stanford is the one that I know of in California. So if you go into rural private practice in an underserved community and you're a Stanford graduate, you can qualify for loan forgiveness. But that's very, very rare. There's nothing else like it in California. So institutionally, the institutions, including law schools and state bar organizations, anybody who's in the loan forgiveness business, right, I think would do rural communities a great service by expanding the opportunities for loan forgiveness, recognizing that even if you're in private practice in a rural community, that is a form of public service. So did you want me to say more, Professor Metzger, or did I hit the high points?
No, I guess I just want to, you absolutely hit the high points. I also want to emphasize that one thing we don't have is a federal initiative to green legal deserts that resembles what the federal government has invested in improving medical deserts in star communities. Now, there are mixed results in terms of what works and what doesn't. There are a couple of recent studies that kind of do a meta-analysis of all the literature, but there has been no federal investment in the legal side of what goes on in star communities, other than in the limited context of some recent federal investments, for example, in policing and prosecution in Alaska, some tribal initiatives. And again, I want to highlight here, we haven't talked about it much, but that tribal communities do have very different challenges, right? Because there are additional cultural concerns, there are choice of law problems that are quite significant and require additional training. And of course, some of the things that we talked about earlier with, for example, lay judges may actually be very culturally appropriate in those contexts. But the tribal communities in Alaska are really the place where we've seen the federal government putting its efforts. VAWA hasn't been refunded in ways that would enable new resources to flow to some smaller jurisdictions for prosecution resources and victim services as well. So there's really a lack of federal investment here. On the topic of recruitment, we had a really interesting question, and I'm going to read it to the group. I've had some real challenges with gendered expectations with respect to trailing spouses and partners. Men seem to have a little problem with the expectation that their partners will follow them. Women don't seem to get the same automatic support. And so the people who accept positions may be disproportionately male, and the men may stay longer than the women. I'm going to piggyback on that question and just note that the dual spouse problem is a recruitment challenge, right? In our publication, we mention a town in North Dakota that managed to recruit lawyers to the town by offering just a free office for somebody, and managed to scoop up a husband and wife team who were coming in together, right? But the dual career couple is a challenge. So the questioner is emphasizing the gender disparity there, and also asking what she can do to improve the diversity of the attorneys she brings on board and the retention of the women that she hires. And again, this would be true, I think, we're talking really about defenders, prosecutors, judges, bearing in mind that sometimes we're talking about panel lawyers, contract prosecutors, and part-time judges, as well as full-time staff. So let me throw that open and ask if anybody wants to volunteer to take the first crack at this one. All right, I'm tagging you, Kristen.
So I hope I answer this well. I would say that when we plug Redfield, when we're trying to bring in professionals or people to our county, as Ryan had said, we hit the highlights as to what our small community can offer, the benefits of living in an agricultural area. We take them to the schools. We go introduce them to small business owners. There's a tremendous amount of safety here and a beauty in having kids that can walk down the street with their dogs and moms with strollers. Dads can go out hunting and fishing, and to have that kind of an environment, it's really a beautiful thing. And so I think with the gender disparity, it's probably absolutely true. However, there's a lot of things that agricultural and rural environments that can offer to the male gender as well. The safety and the security to the female gender is important. So I think you kind of look at what your individual community is, what you bring to the table, and then you maximize that and you use that as your focus. But the idea that you're giving up something to move into a rural community, I think that's an inappropriate or a sad way to look at it, because there's a tremendous amount of benefit that the rural communities can offer. And it's a great way to grow up. And again, I just think it's a resource that they need to kind of highlight rather than look at it as a disadvantage to overcome.
I'll jump in. I think one of the big themes for me, or that I'm trying to impart, is that you have to build relationships. You have to know your communities. I'm really lucky. We have a really prosperous medical community, both in Ashland, Rice Lake, Superior. We have Superior Duluth, which is a metropolitan-ish area. So there's definitely some positives that I can sell. But I think you just need to know your community. A lot of younger attorneys are looking for, brew pubs and hip places to go. We don't have a lot of hip places, but there's a lot of innovation going on, a lot of breweries popping up in rural areas. And I think just making sure you're pushing your new attorneys and older attorneys to those spots again, we don't have 5 or 6 of them, but, you know, building that relationship, knowing what's in your community, and just trying to, you know, make it look as good, make it look as good as you can.
Lisa?
Yeah, well, no, unfortunately, the gender disparity and the trailing spouses is a problem everywhere. It's a problem in academia. It's a problem in all sorts of hiring. And so, you know, unfortunately, rural lawyer hiring is no different from the norm, although the problem may be slightly more acute, simply because it may be harder to scramble for appropriate career opportunities for the trailing spouse. But you know, in the academy and, you know, universities, we talk about partner opportunity hires. And, you know, that basically means if there's somebody you really want to hire, then you help their spouse find a job either at the university or outside the university. And so that's basically, you know, what Kristen and Ryan are saying, except it's a less formal process. You know, one of the things that's made the South Dakota rural attorney recruitment program so successful, at least based on, you know, what I've read, and I have to put in a plug here for Hannah Haxgard's scholarship on the program, is that entire communities have gotten involved in recruiting these lawyers, and they do things like Professor Metzger was talking about in North Dakota. They help them find office space. They take on, you know, they take on all the needs, including, you know, attorney mentoring for the attorneys that they're recruiting. So they really try to kind of leave no stone unturned in setting the attorney up for success. And if an attorney is bringing in a spouse and a family, then that's just part of the package that the recruiting county you know, needs to be aware of and meet the concerns and the needs of the would-be.
Lisa may have cut out there a little bit, but I think her last line was, she did for me, but to meet the needs of the would-be lawyers. I want to throw something else out there, which is that, you know, there are alternatives to moving everybody to a rural area. There is some evidence that regionalizing services can be a strategy for improving access to criminal lawyers, not necessarily by kind of having people fly in, right, being these kind of drive-by lawyers, but the managed assigned counsel programs in rural areas where there's kind of some regional management of how private lawyers work, as well as some specialization. So, you know, one of the efforts we highlight in our new publication is something that's California has done, where California's Environmental Protection Agency made the decision that local prosecutors really didn't have the resources to handle environmental prosecutions. And now they've added, I think, OSHA workplace, work condition prosecutions. And so they have a circuit riding unit of prosecutors that travel to different star areas to supply prosecution in those unique cases that require the resources that are associated with an environmental prosecution. And that frees up resources locally to improve recruitment efforts and opportunity efforts for the people that you are going to bring in to live in the community. So that's another alternative. I want to put a pin in this for just a second and turn to a question that we just got, because I think, Ryan, I may be ready to make a match here. I have someone writing in saying that she's studying at the University of Wisconsin Law. She's interested in rural positions for summer and postgrad. Doug, I'm sorry, I don't think I can get her to the Marina Islands. You may get me, but she grew up in rural Iowa and wants to know, and this is really a question more in some place for Lisa as an academic, but what is it that law schools can do to get students more involved with STAR communities through their education, besides going to the career office? You know, we talk in our publication about one possibility, which is using law school clinics, not to supplant legal services, right? Clinics can't provide the volume of services that communities need, but to expose students to rural practice, small town practice. At the University of Washington, I think there's a law school clinic that is a tribal public defender, and the clinic itself provides the public defense services. There are law schools that have provided prosecution services for tribes. So there's an exposure piece, and I want to ask Lisa to talk about that, and then Ryan, I'm going to help you make a match that will make you and Abby happy.
Great, thanks. So yes, I absolutely believe there is so much that law schools can do. There's really a lot of low-hanging fruit. It take us back to South Dakota, my favorite model, and to tell you that every year the Chief Justice of South Dakota goes to the University of South Dakota and he talks to the 1Ls and he legitimizes rural practice. So he was really the driving force, one of the driving forces in South Dakota behind the rural attorney recruitment program, and he remains, deeply, deeply committed to rural South Dakota. And that again may not be a great model for every state. I can't imagine the Chief Justice of California making the rounds at the dozen California law schools and doing that. But there are other proxies, if you a justice who can talk to students, and there are things that law schools can do, like maybe offering a course that would be suitable for somebody who's planning to go into solo practice, some sort of general broad brush course that incubators do, like teaching how the economics of small firm management, mental clinics, a great opportunity. Environmental justice clinics often have rural components, but very often these clinics are not sort of branded as rural opportunities. And I think it would be great if they were co-branded. If you have an environmental justice clinic that's doing work in a rural area, then also talk about the rural component of social justice, right? Because lots of law students are drawn to social justice work, but they may not be thinking of rural communities as an opportunity to do that sort of social justice work. So I think whether it's clinics, mentoring, obviously I've talked about loan forgiveness, but I think just talking about rural as a credible and rewarding career choice. I mean, we have to sort of redefine success. We're so far down this path of sort of depopulating rural America and even further depopulation of legal professionals that it gets harder and harder, but it still can be done. And I think law schools absolutely have a hugely important role to play.
So I want to throw out a couple of other suggestions that we've seen in doing our research. Two strategies we've seen a lot of are pipelines that start earlier and earlier, and incubators. And I want to just kind of throw these two ideas out, maybe we can talk about them. One strategy we've seen, Bowen, Little Rock has a program like this. There are a number of others. Incubators that start at the undergraduate level. We've even seen some at the high school level, but start with undergraduates and say, participate in this program. We'll fast track you into our state university. You'll spend your college summers interning with a rural lawyer. You'll attend some law school classes. And so the exposure has started very early in some of those programs. And we've seen a number of those both at the college level and at the law school level. Later this week, we'll actually be putting up on our website at the Deason Center a list of some of those programs. I hope it's incomplete in the sense that they're constantly popping up. That's a good thing. And so folks might want to look at those as models. The challenge there is these are early days. And so we still don't have a lot of information about the return on investment there. How long are people staying? How long are they coming? South Dakota solved that problem by requiring a 5-year investment, right, of time. That's the durational treatment, right, of what they expect. But not every program has that. So there is the pipelining approach. The other is the approach of incubators. Colorado has one of these that's kind of a fellowship / incubator for rural prosecutors. Montana has one for rural law practices. And these are programs where bar associations are essentially creating incubators like startups, where they'll put people in touch with more experienced lawyers in rural areas. They will provide sometimes small practice boot camps. The program in Colorado uses a lot of remote technology to make it work. So many times the people who are in the incubator program are in Denver, but they're partnered with mentors who are in rural areas of Colorado. They're getting to know them. And that has had the advantage, hopefully, of letting some of the folks who are retiring think about succession planning. So I'm curious whether any of the three of you have seen these incubators or pipeline programs in progress. And again, by pipeline, I mean not just recruitment, but starting in schools. And I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are about them. Yeah, Kristen.
I haven't seen an actual incubator being utilized beyond what you had noted in South Dakota, where Chief Justice Gilbertson is amazing in visiting the law school. I've been able to speak at the law school as well. I do speak locally, though, at career fairs here. I think that there's probably a fear with people that are considering moving to rural communities. They're not going to be able to make a living. And if they have a reference point, someone that they're seeing that's actually in the practice or has been living in that environment, that there's options for making a living, all of the different things they can do with a law degree, the ways they can benefit the community, and they show them a path forward. And so it's not just this ethereal idea of, I'm going to move out there and trade, a pig for a will, or, a goat for a DUI defense, that there's actually a way to make money. You're going to be benefiting your community. I think that that's invaluable to allow people that are considering, even at the high school age, through college, if there's a way to tap into college seniors that are looking at pre-law or political science, and absolutely in the law school. I think it'd be a great idea too to touch it each year, first, second, and third, depending on what the availability is, so that in every year that you're in law school, you might have different wishes or hopes or goals, and that you kind of revisit that and let them see the progress path they could have.
Well, and it's interesting you say that, Kristen, because there are lots of interesting and opportune touch points for us to talk about STAR practice that we don't use. So for example, in the legal profession class, which is mandatory, the ABA requires it, the reality is that conflicts are an enormously challenging problem in rural communities, right? That's actually how I got into this issue. Understanding the fact that you may not have enough lawyers to provide conflict-free representation in a timely manner. Our ethics rules don't necessarily address that in a way that's helpful and practical. And there are opportunities for us as a profession, and here I'm talking about legal academics, to make sure, as Lisa says, that we're not just redefining success, but that we are including STAR communities and STAR legal practice in our broader discussion of what the issues are in practice, how you get professional satisfaction, how you make a career. I want to touch for a second on this question again of making it financially viable. And I want to talk about two challenges that we've seen come up and hear from you guys about them. One is benefits. Right? The longer that if you're handling cases on a per case basis or a contract basis, you're not getting insurance, you're not getting retirement benefits, even if 100% of your income is coming from these public contracts as prosecutors or defenders. And then the other piece is that, as Kristen mentioned earlier, there's no guarantee, right? Nobody knows when the money is coming, and not everyone pays as promptly, Kristen, as your experience has been in South Dakota. I'm very confident saying that people do have to chase the money from the government. In other places, and rates can be devastatingly low. Ryan, do you have thoughts about this?
Well, we're really lucky that, if you're a staff attorney, we have really great benefits from the state. So that's definitely a piece. I mean, if you can have a spouse, going back to something we talked about before, you can have a spouse that doesn't have insurance, but the other spouse is a staff attorney or a district attorney or assistant AG. They can have those benefits, get paid a little less, but the other spouse can be free to start a business or work wherever they can find work and not have that concern. I think for private bar, it is an issue. I mean, they make higher salaries, but they have different benefit structures. So I know that's definitely a concern. I don't know if there's necessarily a solution that I'm aware of in Wisconsin, but I think it's definitely part of the analysis with, it helps to couple, because, maybe your spouse will have the insurance and you can make money, vice versa.
Oh, I was curious, Lisa, any other thoughts about this in terms of benefits versus a guaranteed flat rate, or opportunity to acquire benefits even if at a reduced rate, those kinds of things?
Well, again, I think you're identifying an extremely important issue, but it's one that cries out for a structural solution, right? So you mentioned earlier, why don't we have a federal program that's like the federal program that channels position into rural communities? And so again, here it seems to me that this is a big problem that's going to be very hard to solve on a piecemeal basis. Some people, as Ryan is suggesting, are going to get lucky. You're going to have you may be doing, contract work and not be not have access to benefits, but if your partner does, well, then the problem is solved. But to solve it, across the board is going to take, action from, legislators or, it's going to take high level, broad-based action to solve that sort of challenge. And in fact, I think, a lot of these challenges are really crying out for big solutions. We have to decide as a nation, the value that we place in rural communities and the things that they need. And in the case of the criminal justice system, things that are constitutionally mandated, and then we have to be willing to pay for them because they're going to be paid for one way or another, right?
Yeah, they're going to be paid for on the front end or on the back. At least we hope so. So we've highlighted some real sort of barriers to entry here, right? There's the fear and the unfamiliarity, the lack of exposure. There's the financial risk, the challenges of solo practice. And there is this conversation about, is there a more global solution? I'm also wondering whether there are small steps that people could take that might at least feel small, but they could turn out to be very big. I mean, Kristen, you spoke the other day just about bar fees, right? Bar breed, bar admission fees, et cetera. Can you talk about just some of these smaller things that actually are quite expensive and might be very meaningful?
So part of the investment when you're relocating, especially from out of state, is not just your considerations as far as housing, how you're going to cover your overhead for staff or for rent, and then also the transportation costs. Does your state have reciprocity? Do you have to take the bar again? I did. I had to take it in South Dakota because I worked privately for many years. I did some part-time in-house legal counsel work, but it wasn't enough to waive in. So you have the bar prep fees if you're going to be doing that. And the bar exam itself is an expensive thing to undertake when you have all of those other bills that are coming down the pike as well. So as you noted, there's a tremendous investment that the medical community is taking and getting rural areas outfitted with medical practitioners. The legal field could do that as well, to allow for either bar waiver fees or for states adjoining to look at better reciprocity practices, and to allow maybe as kind of a subsidy or a stipend if you're going to invest 5 to 10 years into a rural community or into public interest work, the availability to have some kind of financial assistance. These people are going to be injecting themselves into your communities to be bringing money back into the community. So it's not cycling outside to other counties and to other businesses that are far away. I mean, every county to survive needs to have theoretically a medical doctor, a lawyer, an insurance agent, a school system, gas stations. I mean, you have to have these things to have a community to be viable and sustainable. And so to be able to, you shouldn't look at it like, well, you're just throwing money out the window for these people to come in and work here. You're giving them something just to come here. What you're doing is you're re-injecting it back into your community. And so I think for people to have assistance with, again, with bar passage, with prep courses, admissions into bars, and have all of that be parameters inside what that's going to look like for other rural attorney programs or other programs to bring back investments of legal services, I think it would be monumental and probably help shift a lot of people and make them reconsider at least a second time going into a rural community.
Those are great points, Kristen. Ryan?
I just kind of wrote down maybe access to state bar resources for free, maybe a mileage reimbursement program that state bar or the state would pay for, not necessarily the public defender's office, free CLE or training opportunities, maybe tax benefits or tax write-offs, because I mean, you make a good point. I mean, you're both Professor Metzger and Kristen, that you're really reinvesting or investing in these communities, and you think you're going to make the community better if you have these things and people can grow. You have a law office, maybe you have another office that then you're going to need a court reporter starts living there, and it kind of grows from there. And I think with these really small steps, or these really small pieces, you really start building this wall. And I think looking at communities, investing in these places, and I don't think it's even, Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative. It's just, you have this responsibility to these communities, to these people, to offer the same services. And I think you have to, so I think just having this conversation and then building from that are small things we could do, or that could be done.
So I want to throw another idea out there for the group, because it's something that no one on this webinar has mentioned it, and yet it is absolutely the trend in managing the challenges of STAR communities in the courthouses, which has been to downsize, consolidate, and close, right? So across the country, we see police departments even closing, right? People are importing their police officers. We see courthouses consolidating. New York, Minnesota, lots of places have published guides on how to consolidate your courthouses. And then you have other places like Nevada that say, well, we're not going to close them, but Nevada actually has a yearly or bi-yearly publication, right, about judicial travel. And it's interesting to me that no one on this call has said, yeah, the solution is to consolidate, right? Let's just make everybody go together. And you guys can't see it on the webinar, but Ryan and Kristen are both shaking their heads to beat the band. So let's talk about this, because this is something that that CASCA is proposing. The National Center for State Courts talks about it. It's a very hot topic right now in terms of managing the challenges of STAR communities. Why does consolidation feel like the wrong answer to you? Ryan.
So so most of my counties are one-judge counties. One county I cover has 2 judges, and we have the right of substitution in Wisconsin for civil and criminal matters. So there's already a lot of travel in counties that by our constitution require a judge in each county. Consolidation, it's just access to the courts. I mean, it's really having that courthouse open. So if you're consolidating, I couldn't imagine having 2 or 3 counties sharing one judge. I mean, as it is, it's so hard to get on the docket on a motion hearing schedule or a trial schedule, right? I mean, this is pre-COVID. So I couldn't imagine sharing a DA or sharing a state attorney or whatever people call them, and sharing a judge. I mean, it's not just even from a criminal perspective, but it's just, that eviction or that small claim or that divorce or that family matter. It's really a question of access to courts. And I think, working in Green Bay and being able to, have a bail hearing 2 days later, 3 days later, compared to, Ryan, we have time 2 weeks from now. Well, what that guy or that woman is sitting in custody, losing their job, losing their kids, losing their housing. So, I mean, as it is, I think more judges or traveling judges adding on, is something that I would advocate for, not necessarily taking judges or taking prosecutors or taking public defenders away. I think that, sometimes when we talk about these proposals, would you consider that in Milwaukee? Would you consider that in Madison? Would you consider that in Minneapolis? Of course not. But when it's, St. Cloud or Duluth or Virginia, for some reason it's okay to save money. And I think, going back to fairness and going back to, criminal, it's 14th Amendment due process, equal protection. But I think these communities deserve the same type of services. Not the same. I'm not advocating for 5 or 6 judges, but I definitely think that conversation hasn't even happened in Wisconsin. So that's why I think I'm having a really emotional response, because I can't imagine it would just get even worse.
So, it's interesting, Ryan, to hear you talk about this, because, we do know places, for example, in Oregon, where judges ride circuits still. Mississippi recently had a due process litigation with a woman who was detained 96 days without seeing a judge or a lawyer, because under state statute, since she'd been indicted, she wasn't entitled to an initial appearance. So she couldn't see anybody until the next session of court, and court met 4 sessions a year. Okay, shameless plug here. I have a new publication about this, right? About why initial appearances need to be prompt. But it's a challenge in rural communities, right? It's a challenge in small communities.
And I've been really lucky that judges, I say, Your Honor, this person just got in, has been sitting here since Friday, let's have that hearing. And they've been really responsive. But I just can't imagine how people can, again, it's sunlight, right? And just talking about it and getting it out there that this is happening. Riverside,
you and I can have a whole Riverside conversation, but I guess what I'll say here about the consolidation trend is it's really interesting, because there are different ways to consolidate, right? You can consolidate by closing courthouses, which is one model. And you can consolidate by consolidating staff who then have to travel, right? Which tends to be increase individual distances, but provide services to the community. And for those that are interested in kind of what this looks like, Alaska is a really good model. I mean, on the one hand, Alaska is a state-operated system, but the Alaska Supreme Court has gone pretty far in saying, look, people don't want to close their local courthouses, right? You can read about this in all kinds of places. These are important community centers. And so people in Alaska, you know, they'll take dog sleds to get to jury duty, right? They'll helicopter in. Local courts, local justice matters to people. And so I think the other piece here is really thinking about how to communicate what the presence, the physical presence of a criminal justice system that functions means to a community, even with all the problems that, you know, we've talked about, including the overlapping personal relationships and balancing those challenges. We're getting very close to the end, but we had a couple other questions that came in. One that I want to raise because I think it is an important conversation. Does anyone have any ideas, I'm just reading from the question, about how to make overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly conservative rural areas less daunting to BIPOC and LGBTQ applicants? Cultural considerations can be a huge stumbling block no matter what a community's amenities are. So before I ask you guys to answer, I guess I want to point out one thing, which is that the diversity of STAR communities is highly variable. And so in the Black Belt, right, the American South, you may have substantial minorities or even majority minority communities, right? In the West, which has most of the rural land, you will have fewer rural people and it tends to be more white. Tribal communities are predominantly rural, although there are some urban ones. But these cultural challenges are pervasive. And for example, we see more Hispanic people moving into rural areas, but you know, we don't quite kind of know what this is going to look like. And we hear rumors that maybe COVID is sending people back to rural communities. I'll believe it when I see it. As, you know, really living there as opposed to vacation houses. But I'd like to ask us, do you have thoughts about what it means to expand the diversity of criminal law practitioners in these much smaller settings? Oh, Kristen, go for it. Oh, no, Ryan, I'm trying to figure out who's gesturing.
No, I can jump in. So I'm a Black gay man that lives in rural northwestern Wisconsin. It's a little different than, you know, Mississippi or Alabama, but I think rural people. So I just had a jury trial last week and I won. So I think rural juries and I think rural people want genuine people. So if you're going to come in and be yourself and just say, this is who I am, this is what I'm about, deal with it and let them get to know you. I think I haven't personally had a problem. I think people in rural communities can smell fakeness. So if you're going to, you know, wear overalls and whatever, I think that's not gonna fly. But you have to be who you are and what you're about, and I think that is more important than trying to fit in. I also understand that rural communities can be intimidating and that they can be closed-minded, and that's just the reality. But I think when you're trying to connect with a community, being genuine, being yourself, being respectful goes a long way.
Yeah, Kristen, anything you want to add?
I agree 1,000%. I would say that it's important, at least initially, I would suggest introducing yourself to local governments, either city council, chamber of commerce. You have to get out there and plug into the community. They, especially in the Midwest, they are so, I guess, friendly and accommodating, but they're not going to necessarily get in your business. You have to go to them first and introduce yourself. So I would say get involved, invest in the community. If you show them that you are there to improve the community and that you're there to help make their lives better and that you have an authentic wish in order to plug in and be of assistance to them and their family through all of their hardships, they're going to reinvest in you too. Because again, you're going to be part of their community, part of their success. And part of general practice is going to be helping them with their wills, with their family law. If they have an adoption, if they have a child that got in trouble, abuse and neglect hearings. I mean, you're going to touch all of the facets of their life and you're going to become integral to them And you're also going to be a part of their community. You're going to be a part of the base of the foundation of their community. So it's, you know, there's a couple months where you're still trying to get your name out there. But the more you plug in, the more that you're seen, the more that they watch you in court and they see you at the grocery store. I mean, all of those things are going to build trust with them. So I think that diversity is important, and I hope it happens throughout rural communities, but there's going to be a curve, and just kind of stick with it and do your best and show your true self.
All right. Well, so I know that Lisa has to go and we're getting near the end of our time. Lisa, any parting thoughts for our audience here? And I'm going to ask Ryan and Kristen the same before we say thank you to everybody.
I just want to say that I want both Ryan and Kristen on my advocacy team, my, Save Rural America advocacy team. But I also just really appreciate their, very genuine comments about what it's like to go into rural communities. Particularly, Ryan saying, I'm a Black gay man, and look, I can make this work. I also have former students, gay students who've gone into rural communities, and they say it is just absolutely not an issue in my community. They have made themselves indispensable. But these are challenging issues, and we can't, it's not within our control as legal educators or as legal professionals, unfortunately, to change existing dynamics. And these are very real concerns for students. I did a survey a number of years ago of students, of law students in Arkansas, and this was an issue that came up. We don't want to go into a rural community because it's so retrograde, or, I'm a person of color and I wouldn't want to go into a rural community. So these are very commonly, I don't want to overstate it. These are commonly expressed concerns. And so, they're certainly legitimate concerns, but I'm very, very heartened by what, Ryan and Kristen are saying about their experiences. And I think that really demonstrates, some of the best of rural America, these positive experiences that they're having. So thank you so much for including me in this. And I'm sorry I have to pop out a few minutes early, but best of luck to everybody.
It's not a star event if we don't have you. Ryan, last words. Well, I don't mean last words. I mean last words for the webinar.
For sure. No. Again, thank you so much for having me. I'm very passionate about public defense first and rural America second. I think it's relationship building. It's representing people. It's really being in that community, and I really appreciate my community accepting me. I've been in this office for about 2.5 years, and it really has. Yeah, so I'm really excited about where I am. Really excited about what I do. I'm really grateful to be able to talk about this issue. And again, I think I threw my email address somewhere. But if anyone has any questions or, my journey doing this work, I'm always really excited to talk about being a public defender first, rural America second. So thank you so much again for having this and inviting me to it.
Thanks, Ryan, and thanks for all your contributions to our rural justice efforts. Ryan's one of our steering committee members, actually. Kristen.
I would just echo what Ryan said. I'm available also if anybody has any questions or wants to kind of discuss the process. I would just reiterate what I've said in the beginning. It's been the best professional decision I ever could have made to plug into South Dakota into this program. I think it's an amazing program, and it's doing a tremendous amount of good. I think that for people that are considering it, just know that you're not going to be stuck in a closet somewhere in a huge office writing briefs for the next 10 years. You'll actually be in court. You're going to be able to see the real life changes that your cases are going to have for your clients. And you'll be able to handle different types of cases. And so there's going to be a much different type of law practice that you'll have here than you'll ever have if you're in a firm of 100 people. And they're probably not going to know your name.
Well, thank you, Kristen. So I want to just issue another big thank you to our panelists, to all the team at the Deason Center that helped us put this together. And I want to acknowledge some of our partners who are out there in the community, the National District Attorneys Association, the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers in particular, who have sponsored numerous other rural events and STAR events, including our 2018 and 2019 Rural Criminal Justice Summits. We had planned a STAR Criminal Justice Summit for this year, but COVID. But we look forward here at the Deason Center to bringing you more programming, more opportunities. to think about, learn about, and get involved with STAR criminal justice. In November, we'll be hosting a webinar led by Dr. Andy Davis and Victoria Smiagaki, two of our data scientists who are doing a research project with the Texas Bar Foundation, getting into really the nitty-gritty of what it looks like to try and bring more lawyers or bring greater access to criminal lawyers to rural communities. And so we're very excited about those findings. As I mentioned earlier, our publication is up online. It'll be available to you later today. We do have an active STAR Criminal Justice Coalition. We have a newsletter that launches later this month, and we'll be putting increasing resources up, including a short bibliography of some articles and resources that might be helpful, and a list of pipeline programs. So I do hope that you'll join us. We look forward to hearing from you again. Thank you again so much to Lisa Pruitt, who's not with us still, to Kristen Kochekian, and to Ryan Reid, and again to all the team here at the Deason Center who made this happen. Thank you guys so much.